Good morning, everyone. My name is Jane Wolanski. As a member of AJC's Board of Governors, I'm delighted to welcome you to this morning's AJC University session, Social Media, a Force for Good or Evil. We've all seen the tremendous capacity of the internet to bring people together and make the world a better place. For nearly 2 decades, Google's unofficial slogan was the simple phrase, "Don't be evil." Yeah. From Facebook to Twitter to Instagram and beyond, social media platforms have been central to all of our lives. We use them to share personal stories, catch up on news, opinions, and the latest gossip, raise money for critical causes, organize around issues we're passionate about, and connect to individuals around the world. But just as social media can bring people together, it can also show us the worst in people. We've seen live-streamed attacks on houses of worship and schools. We've lived under the threat of radicalization from outside forces seeking to destroy our way of life, as well as from a hostile power trying to undermine our democracy. And we've been bombarded with an armada of false news stories from once isolated conspiracy theorists who never before had a megaphone to broadcast their dangerous ideas. Social media have changed the world. That much isn't in doubt. But has it been, above all, a change for good or for evil? Today we're joined by 3 experts who will help us understand the social and political impact of social media. Dan Shefet is the founder of the Association for Accountability and Internet Democracy and a crusader for internet privacy. Amy Spitalnick is the executive director of Integrity First for America and is in the process of suing the Nazis who marched in Charlottesville. And Sha'arik Zafar is manager on Facebook's public policy team, focusing on countering hate speech. Our conversation will be moderated by AJC's own Avi Meir, no stranger to social media himself, managing director of AJC's Global Communications. Please join me in giving our panel a warm welcome. And Avi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I have to say that the title of this session reminds me of that old Jewish joke about Yussel, who's living in a shtetl in Poland, and who receives a telegram from his cousin in the next town over that reads, "Start worrying, details to follow." And when it comes to social media, it seems like there's plenty to worry about. As was mentioned earlier, from live stream attacks like the one at the mosques in Christchurch, to instructions on how to murder Jews that are circulated on social media, to fake news and replicas of genuine news sites that are made to look as though they're real. And on the other hand, there is, of course, the more positive side of social media. We wouldn't be able to share what's happening at this incredible conference without social media. It is an incredible force for bringing people together, for uniting around issues that are important to us and to people who are like us and people who are unlike us, and to bring us together around those issues. So the question that is before us is not a simple one, and I think one that requires a lot of nuance. And I think we're going to start with you, Amy, to tell us a little bit about your background and your connection to this issue through your professional work.
So thank you, everyone, for being here. It's such a pleasure for us to be part of this conference and to see such a full room. So as was said earlier, I run an organization called Integrity First for America, and what we are doing is, I guess, quite literally suing neo-Nazis and white supremacists. That was easy. And the basis for our case is the deep conspiracy that was planned and executed ahead of the violence, or ahead of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville almost 2 years ago in August 2017. A number of people think that what happened there might have been this spontaneous violence that happened because there were some protests and counter-protests, but what our suit details is actually an extensively, meticulously planned conspiracy to commit violence. The neo-Nazi leaders and white supremacist leaders who were responsible for what happened went online on a social media site called Discord and a number of other platforms, and using those sites through those chat rooms and other forums, meticulously planned exactly what ended up happening. They talked about which weapons to bring, whether they could run over protesters with cars and claim self-defense, which is, of course, exactly what happened. And through sort of a lucky break in our case, a couple weeks after Charlottesville happened, some white hat hackers, a site called Unicorn Riot, through means we're not entirely sure of, were able to get their hands on these chats and release them publicly. And that really provides the basis for the suit that we've brought under a statute called the KKK Act of 1871. This is a statute that I don't think any of us thought we'd need to be using in 2019, but in the world that we live in, we do, unfortunately. It's a statute that's meant to protect against conspiracies to commit racially motivated violence. It was first created by the Reconstructionist Congress as a means of protecting the recently freed slaves. And here in 2019, we're using it in court because the neo-Nazis and white supremacists in Charlottesville went online and conspired to commit racially motivated violence. I think, many of us know the underlying hate that drives these guys, and I don't think none of us are naive enough to believe that they didn't exist for the last few decades. But what we're here to talk about today, I think, is the way in which the internet and social media in particular has allowed them to find one another, connect, and really conspire to commit the violence that we saw in Charlottesville, and unfortunately, the many other attacks and heinous threats and other incidents that we've seen over the last few years. The one thing that I will end with before I pass it back to Avi is our case is about Charlottesville. It's about holding these guys responsible for what they did. But they're also, the leaders and groups that are at the center of our case are also at the center of a much larger online network that has connections to so many of the other awful things we've seen in recent years. So the Pittsburgh shooter communicated with some of our defendants on another social media site called Gab in the weeks leading up to his attack. The Christchurch shooter painted on his gun a symbol known as the fashtag, the fascist hashtag, that was popularized by another one of our defendants. And that same symbol was found at the Highlander Center arson attack in Tennessee a few months ago. So the guys that we are suing are really at the center of this much larger network. This case has the potential to bankrupt and dismantle a key piece of that network. Happy to talk a little bit more about that later. But it really does showcase the way in which social media and the internet has been used as a force for bad, for evil. That being said, we're all in this room, and Integrity First for America is able to do what it's doing because the internet also exists as a force for good. We're out there building support for our case through social media channels. So I think there's a lot to talk about in both directions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Amy. Dan, you come at this issue from a slightly different perspective. You have also used legal means to pursue your aims, but you've actually targeted the social media platforms themselves. Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely, with great pleasure. Well, thanks everybody for great pleasure to be here. And thank you for the work you're doing. That's great. Looking forward to the judgment. When do you expect the case to come down?
We expect trial in early 2020, so it's coming up.
Something to look forward to.
Okay, looking very much forward and really wish you the best of luck. Great job. I've been working on what you call content regulation. I was introduced as being a privacy crusader, and thank you very much for that. But I think that what we're talking about right now is content regulation. That is to say, how do we hold the social media and the search engines accountable for content which we all know is generated or created by third parties? Facebook does not create the toxic content in question, others do. So how do we hold them accountable for that? That's really the big question. That's the big challenge we all have from a legal point of view. And I came to that through a study that I did for UNESCO some 3 or 4 years ago on radicalization on the internet. This is extremely interesting. The study actually caused me to travel to almost 32 countries, interview the same number of ministers of justice and interior, working with some counter-terrorist units, and especially with psychologists and sociologists. Because the first question we have to ask ourselves is there a correlation between what you read on the internet and what you actually do? or in other terms, the correlation between content and behavior. Now, we all know that obviously there is in terms of advertising, because that is really what keeps the internet alive. So if there's no correlation between content and behavior, nobody would be advertising on it. But is there also a correlation in terms of human behavior of a nefarious sort, of any kind of nefarious sort? Or does the internet just work as a catalyst to allow you to share views that you had in any case, and maybe it will allow you to also act in a certain way, but you would probably have done it in any case? That has been a major challenge for psychologists all over the world, especially on radicalization, whether or not this myth of the guy sitting in the bedroom and becoming a radicalized terrorist, even though he was perfectly normal 2 weeks before. We've all heard about that myth, that legend. Now, is that true or is it not true? I had occasion to interview a leading German psychologist in the field, and he had actually been interviewing some of the prisoners in Guantanamo. It was extremely interesting. Most of the information, especially, of course, the names, are confidential, but there is consensus today, let me say it this way, that yet indeed the content on the internet acts more than just a catalyst. It actually has the potential of radicalizing perfectly normal people. I think that is extremely interesting from a scientific point of view, because if a completely normal person can end up becoming a radicalizing ISIS terrorist, what about the less evil, which is that of professing incitement to hatred and not actually perpetrating the crime? From a logical point of view, the risk of that should be greater than radicalizing a normal person to commit a terrorist attack. And yes, indeed, there is consensus. Some psychologists do not share this view, I have to say, but there is more or less consensus, let's put it this way, that indeed content has that behavioral effect. Now, once you've arrived at that conclusion, which is, again, a scientific conclusion, what do you do about that? Now, one of the things that you can do about it is what you're doing. You're going after the really bad guys, the authors of the content, and also the persons that perpetrate the crimes. But unfortunately, that does not seem to be enough. Unfortunately, we need to go also after the infrastructure that allows them to commit these crimes and to brainwash people. And that means the social media infrastructure, and that means also the search engines, the Googles and the Facebooks, and I hope that you'll respond to that, and the Twitters. So how do we, from a legal point of view, hold the infrastructure providers accountable for what flows through their pipes? Right? That's the challenge we need to address, because now we know that there is a correlation. We ought to do something about it. That legal problem really is extremely complicated and also addresses certain fundamental values of society, the most important value being that of free speech. At the same time, we got to, free speech, no doubt about it. I think everybody in this room subscribes to free speech. But at the same time, at least with our European tradition, we have in the European Convention of Human Rights, Article 17, an explicit provision that says that all rights, all human rights, including free speech, can be abused. You need to strike the balance. And of course, the conflicting human rights that we have here are free speech against the right to life. In Europe, we have tons of cases striking that balance before the European Court of Human Rights, where sometimes it swings this way, sometimes it swings that way. The point I want to make here is that there is no absolute free speech in Europe, as opposed to what seems to be the case in this country. And I say that deliberately and hopefully provoking a bit, because if we want to hold the social media and the infrastructure accountable, we need to have a more relativistic approach to free speech. We need to put in place a system which holds the providers of toxic content accountable for the consequences. Now, if we look at it from a legal point of view, holding someone accountable for what a third party does is the theory of legal complicity, or vicarious liability, or secondary liability, or whatever you want to call it. Now, if we look at intellectual property law, we've had that for a number of years. Actually, it's very interesting that in this country, the infrastructure provider, especially U2, has had a lot of cases like that, may be complicit in violation of copyright infringement if they don't take down the infringing video or music immediately. I think it's thought-provoking that they're not complicit if they don't take down toxic content that calls to incitement, genocide, and perpetration of hate crimes. I don't see why human creativity, i.e. intellectual property rights, should be better protected than human integrity, which we are all born with. So the platform that we are working on, when I say we, it is the Association for Accountability in Internet Democracy, is really to find a way to extrapolate the accountability standard that we see in intellectual property law so that it should apply also to toxic content. And the real challenge we have here is the Communications Decency Act from 1996. Who knows about that act in this room? You, of course, you know about it. It's your Bible. It's your Bible. The Communications Decency Act is a federal law, and it was enacted in 1996. It hasn't been changed that yet. And it's not only your Bible, it is the Bible of Silicon Valley, because this is the federal statute that allows absolute immunity for the infrastructure providers for third-party generated content. It says they're not editors and they're not publishers. That is the challenge we have. And I hope very much that some people in this room will also help us at least try and arrive at some relative immunity standard so that under certain conditions, the social media and the search engines may be accountable for content and may indeed allow us to retrieve the original philosophy of the internet, which was that of inclusiveness, tolerance, and empowerment of the individual, and not what we see today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Shark, you come at this from a slightly different perspective. You had spent some time in government. Now you're with this tech startup out of Silicon Valley.
Yeah. It's on the internet.
Yeah,
if you Google it, you'll...
I think I've heard of it, yeah.
Yeah.
What responsibility do tech companies have to prevent incitement, violence on their platforms?
Look, we absolutely have responsibility. Now, whether it's legal responsibility, moral, ethical, I think that's what we have to talk about. But if I can just take a step back, and it's an honor to be here. This is a terrific group that you've assembled. I have a dear friend from college in the audience, and so it's nice to see some familiar and friendly faces. I started out I'm a lawyer in my federal career as the special counsel for 9/11 backlash, right? So hate crimes against people who look like me, but sometimes you. Sometimes the victim was Portuguese. So we learned, ignorance combined with bigotry is a very dangerous combination. And, for several years now running, unfortunately, the highest number of hate crimes based on religion, of course, anti-Jewish attacks. We just saw the New York Times op-ed about rising anti-Semitism in Europe, right? So that's how I started my federal career, fighting hate crimes. And then, stayed in that war, in the civil rights work, and gradually found myself doing more national security work. So focusing on radicalization. So I was in the intelligence community, doing counterterrorism work, and looking at that process of radicalization. And so, you talked about the role of the internet, and that's something that I followed very closely for a number of years. And we used to think that radicalization was a very linear phenomenon, and then we realized that was our theory of the case, and we recognized that it's really not that simple. There's a number of factors at the individual level. What's happened in my life. There's a group level. I might not be particularly religious or particularly extremist, but if my friends happen to go down a bad path because of group dynamics, and then there's the societal level. It can be ideology, which could be religion, but it doesn't have to be. It can be social, it can be politics. There's a lot of different factors. But one thing that we did notice was the fact that a lot of people were going online. And so these are issues that I worked on from a professional level in government. And so when the opportunity to join Facebook arose, I was talking to my wife, and I was like, this is a platform. It serves billions of people, and I think I can help. Because if you take a step back in terms of, the title of this panel is social media a force for good or evil? And it'd be very easy for me just to sort of like, look, we've connected 2.6 billion people. That's a massive amount. Never in in the world's history have so many people been able to connect and speak and share. You can share with your loved ones, with your friends, with your relatives, and that's meaningful, right? And so that's kind of the ordinary experience of the internet, of social media, that you just take for granted. But there's value in that, right? And we could talk about the support to small businesses. That my platform generates millions of small businesses use Facebook. They use it to advertise. They use it to grow their business. We could talk about what you do and how you grow, fundraise. And when we fundraise when people fundraise on Facebook, we don't charge any fee, right? And so over $1 billion has been raised on fundraising. And you can talk about how people are organizing, and including those who are living under very despotic regimes, that they're actually able to organize and advocate. We could talk about disaster response and the fact that now we have maps that show, where if they're after a disaster, where people have connectivity when they don't. And I could simply just say that, look, these are all the great things about Facebook and social media, and that really it's not our fault. It's to say, if bad people is a vessel, and that people, if you fill a vessel with something bad, then that's what happens. Doing that, I think, would absolve ourselves of responsibility, because I do believe that social media and internet companies do have a responsibility, and we take that very seriously. So, for example, when it comes to hate speech, now the challenge with hate speech, of course, is there's no universally accepted definition. I'm an American lawyer. I believe strongly in the First Amendment, but I'm also a Muslim Pakistani American. I have girls here, and so I recognize that hate speech. I'm not coming from a privileged position. Like, hate speech is relevant to me, right? It's relevant to all of us, right? If you're Jewish, if you're Muslim, if you're a person of color in this country, right? This impacts you, and I do believe that online hate can lead to offline discrimination, offline violence. Absolutely. So, the question is, what do we do, and how do you respond? So at Facebook, we've taken a number of steps. So first, we have community standards. They're kind of our rules on the road. What you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do on Facebook. And so the way we defined hate speech, which is an attack on a person based on protected characteristics, race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, you can't do it. We take it down, right? Now, I want to be open and honest, is that you're able to criticize concepts, right? So that means religion. So if a group of former Muslims want to organize and have a space on Facebook, they're allowed to, and they can criticize religion. You can criticize Judaism, Catholicism, Christianity, capitalism. What that looks like, though, and how is tough. It's hard, right? Now, we talked about the First Amendment. There is no absolute right to free speech in the United States, right? We still have, there's the classic line about fire in a theater, but even that, there's things that you're not allowed to do. But we're not a government. We have no obligation to protect our user speech, right? We're a private company. Now, because we're based in the United States, because the ethos of the company is one based on free expression, we try to get it right. And what we find is there's really three principles that are sort of in conflict. One is voice. So giving people a voice, giving them a chance to express, right? And that's important. One is equity, treating people fairly, right? And one is safety. And I find that oftentimes the hard issues are when those are in tension. When one group of people really want to be very critical about a particular concept, right? That impacts my sense of safety or my sense of equity, right? That doesn't come over the line of violence, but sort of impacts and how we manage that. So we have a set of community standards, and we routinely take things down, right? Now, when it comes to terrorism, which is an issue that I care about, from my days in the intelligence community, we're doing pretty good. We can always do better, but we get about 99% stuff down before anybody sees it, right? There was a recent story that took issue with that, and that was really about things that were happening a few years ago. Now we're about 99% proactively, right? Now with hate speech, we're nowhere there. We're getting closer, but the AI, the artificial intelligence, isn't smart enough yet to detect context. So for example, let's say someone uses a slur against me, right? And and the computer sort of reads it. Let's say I put on my Facebook page, can you believe Avi called me or Amy called me this, right? And those are two very different things. One is somebody's attacking me, right? One is my voice highlighting the fact that I've been attacked, right? The computers aren't smart enough yet, right? So we're not there when it comes to hate speech, right? But we do take it down. And we're getting better. The good news is, even if the AI doesn't get it, if you report it, we do take it down, right? The challenge is, and again, I want to be open and honest, is that we've got 2.6 billion people using our services. It's not just Facebook. It's Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, Messenger. And so even if there's like a fraction of a percent of an error rate, that's still a lot of people. And we recognize that. And so that's why the future really has to be, you have to have people, right? You have to have machines, AI, and you have to have partnerships in civil society, right? It's hard. This is very, very difficult, right? But it's really important because again, having a platform that's safe for our users. If people don't feel safe on our platform, people aren't going to show up, and they're not going to look at ads. It's not going to be good for our business model. So look, this is the right thing to do. It's also the smart thing to do for our business. I'll say one more thing. Mark had an op-ed earlier this year, and he talked Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah, sorry, we're all on a first name basis with Mark Zuckerberg. Right.
Look, I'm wearing a suit for you guys. All right,
thank you for not coming in a hoodie. We appreciate that. Thank you.
After 15 years wearing a suit, I'm in jeans and a T-shirt, but I was like, no, AJC, be a professional.
We appreciate it. We appreciate it.
So Mark Zuckerberg, with a Z.
Thank you.
Had an op-ed, and he talked about just the shift in our business from more of a privacy messaging. But one thing he talked about was regulation, and he goes like, look, we recognize that for the future of the internet, for the best things of the internet to happen, yeah, you do need regulation. Now, regulation. Sheryl Sandberg, she talks about when he talks about regulation, the most important thing is, does it really solve the problem that it seeks to solve? And governments have a role in saying that, look, this is what we want you to do, and they should leave it to companies to meet that standard. Now, that doesn't mean to say that they shouldn't hold us accountable. They absolutely should, right? But we recognize that in many respects, we have too much power over people's speech. Mark said it himself, so it's not just me. And so there are things that we're doing to look at, what are other ways, besides just having Facebook employees to make these calls. So one thing that we're exploring is an external oversight board, which would be an independent body of people like you. You'd be terrific for it. Where people can actually, on these tough calls, where it's a balance of trying to balance someone's equity, someone's voice, safety, where we can have an independent group of outside advisors make these calls for us, because we recognize that, look, now this is not just some small startup. This is we're talking about in many respects a battlefield of ideas, right? And so it's too important not to get right, and we recognize that yes, we have a role to play, governments have a role to play, but we need partners as well.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask one more round of questions, but anyone who has questions for our panelists, please feel free to write them down. We will have an opportunity very shortly. Amy, you chose to go after the perpetrators, not the platforms. Can you walk us through that decision?
Yeah. Well, I think one, and this is an important distinction, especially in light of some of the conversation we just had. Our case is not an incitement case or a speech case. It's a conspiracy case. And speech in this country is not protected if it's used as part of a conspiracy to commit a crime. If you're going to go rob a bank and you go online and you plan with your co-conspirators that robbery, that's admissible in court and part of the case. And the same thing goes for conspiring to commit violence. There have been successful cases that that were brought under incitement theories. And we think there could be an incitement case here in some form. But the stronger case is the fact that they all very explicitly went online, found one another, and conspired to make this violence happen, and make this racially motivated violence happen. This was an explicit anti-Semitic, racist, bigoted plan, and that's exactly what we saw in Charlottesville 2 years ago, and what we've seen in many other circumstances since. And so we thought it was just so clear-cut that is why we brought this case. I think there is a much larger and equally important conversation to be had about the speech implications, the incitement implications, the ways in which social media sites are too often co-opted as essentially sort of like the modern day KKK den, right? Mm-hmm. These are where people are finding each other and radicalizing one another and spreading their hate. In some cases, that turns into the conspiracy that we saw in Charlottesville and can be clearly is clearly illegal under that context. But in other cases, the line gets a little blurred. And that includes stronger regulation on the government front, it includes stronger protections on the platform front. And I think particularly right now, we're at a time where it's fairly clear to at least us that the federal government is not particularly invested in this issue right now. Over the last few years, we've seen the Department of Homeland Security cut its domestic terror unit. We've seen Department of Justice civil rights investigations drop 60% compared to the end of the Obama administration. And these are the programs that would help find and identify these, I think are domestic terrorists and should be treated as such, and help prevent some of these attacks from happening. So it's very clear that the federal government is not particularly interested in helping us here. However, there's a lot more that can be done on the platform front, which I imagine will be part of the ongoing conversation in a different world. And perhaps in a few years from now, there will be more that's done on the government front. I think state and local governments. Before this, I worked for the New York State Attorney General, and we did a lot of work with social media platforms. Less so on the sort of terrorism side, which is very much a federal issue, but on the privacy, on the fake news side. And there's a lot of interrelatedness between those issues. And so while our case is so clear-cut, it also really opens a door into sort of these broader issues that need to be addressed on both the government and the platform side, and provides really a good example of why that's so critical. Why is it so easy for these guys to find each other and plan violence online and radicalize one another? And we know that this is a crisis because it's not just these anecdotal things that are happening in Pittsburgh and Charlottesville and Poway and Christchurch. The numbers back it up, right? Anti-Semitic incidents are up 2/3 year over year, I think 99% over the last 3 years, according to the most recent ADL report. Last year, there were more extremist attacks in the United States than any year since the Oklahoma City bombing, the year that Timothy McVeigh bombed the Oklahoma City building. And so this is very clearly a crisis. The stats back it up. And I think one of the biggest factors behind it, we can talk about the role our political leaders play in encouraging this, but the internet has really been a driving force here. And there is a lot that needs to be done to recognize the crisis that's been created as a result.
So I have one more question before we move on to questions from the audience. And it's really for the both of you. It's sort of a two-sided question. It seems to me like a lot of what you do, Dan, in Europe, you would not be able to do here in the United States due to our free speech protections. The flip side of that is that perhaps European citizens don't have the same protections that we do here in this country for our right to express ourselves freely. How do you navigate that balance? And would you be able to pursue any of your cases in any meaningful way in the United States? And on the flip side, what mechanisms do we have in this country that enable us to, on the one hand, preserve the right to free expression and also control and mitigate hate speech and incitement to violence?
Okay. Thank you. I think, let me share some European experience with you. That's it. Europe is many different countries. First of all, there's the European Union. For the moment, 28, maybe unfortunately, due to Brexit, 27. And then there's the Council of Europe, 47 member states. Let me just say an experience that I had last week. I was in Kiev, in Ukraine, which is not a member of the European Union, but the member of the Council of Europe, and therefore subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights. Now, this is a country that in 1991 achieved independence from the Soviet Union. And we were discussing hate speech. This was a parliamentary committee. And we were discussing restrictions or limitations of free speech as a principle. And you can imagine that, especially with the new president, any restriction of free speech it raises an allergic reaction. It reminds them of the Soviet Union. It creates a lot of connotations that we in other countries in Europe, and that's the point I wish to make, like France and Germany, don't necessarily have. So in terms of free speech, yes, there are countries in Europe where free speech is absolutely necessary to protect, and we take it for granted, but they do not. So that's the first thing I want to make clear. Now let's look at the other countries in Europe, and I mentioned before France and Germany. I've actually worked with both the French government and the German government on the hate speech laws. I should say that the hate speech law in France is not law yet. There's a bill. Okay. It was cleared by the so-called Conseil d'État, which you may call a constitutional court if you wish. Well, to simplify the conclusion of the Conseil d'État, it was that nothing in that proposal violates the principle in French law, the constitutional principle of free speech. The German law, the Netzdurchgesetz, was the first in Europe to hold accountable social media. Nobody mentions the word Facebook, but it needs to have minimum 2 million users, so we know which company it is. And the interesting about the Netzdurchgesetz is that the penalty against Facebook for not taking down content which fits the definition, I'll get back to the definition of hate speech, goes up to 50 million euros. That's pretty hefty. Now, I happen to know the prosecutor in charge of this law, of course, based in Berlin. It's a very nice lady. And I'll occasionally ask her, so did you, because this law has been in effect now for almost 2 years, have you prosecuted Facebook or any other company like that? And the answer is no. The law, with this very clear definition, I'll promise to get back to the definition, and with this very, very, very heavy sanction of 50 million euros, suffices. Social media in Germany actually take down content when they are requested to do so, typically by the Ministry of Justice in Berlin, or it may be by the local Länder, because you know Germany is a federation. By the way, each Länder in Germany has an office in charge of fighting anti-Semitism. One of those is Sabine Leuthäuser-Schnarrenberger, who used to be the Minister of Justice under Angela Merkel, and I'm very pleased to say that she's a member of our board of the Association for Accountability and Democracy. So we know very well what's going on in Germany, and also what's going on in France. Now, and again, the point is that nobody's really shouting and screaming, except maybe countries like the former Soviet Union countries for other reasons. Nobody in these countries is shouting and screaming that this is a violation of our free speech rights. And as I just mentioned, the Conseil d'État in France cleared it. The Bundesgerichtshof, which is the equivalent to the Constitutional Court in Berlin, also cleared it. There's a strong tradition. In France, we have the so-called Loi Guessot from the 90s, which criminalizes negationism. That was tested before the UN High Commission for Human Rights, in a very famous case, whether that was a violation of free speech. And I invite everybody who's interested in the almost symphonic legal reasoning of that UN resolution to read that from 1996, how we move from the protection of free speech as being almost sacred to the acceptance of a law that prohibits negationism. It was an Indian Supreme Court judge, Mr. Bhagwati, who wrote this opinion. I think it's wonderful reading it. So anyway, we have that tradition in Europe. We don't find any problem with free speech. I promise to get back to the definition. There are actually several UN definitions, and in the law, both in the German and the French law, which are almost the same definitions, it's very clear. Now, I have to say that when I use the very clear, that translates into practice. Because both the German law and the French law talks about manifestly illicit content. So when I say very clear, please remember, the content in question has to be manifestly illicit, which means it has to be clear that the potential of the content in question may drive people to commit hate crimes. There is no intentional element. You don't have to prove that the author who put it out there had the intention that something would happen, because that would be an impossible case. It suffices that it has the potential to be dangerous. We may also call it dangerous speech instead of hate speech if you so wish. But it has to be manifest. So Facebook could only meet the fine of 50 million euros in Germany, and according to the French bill, which we think will pass in a couple of weeks. The fine would be 4% of global turnover. Did you just hear what I said? Global turnover, top line. Now, why 4%? 4% because that's what we have in the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which, as you know, passed last 25th of May last year. For various reasons, it's 4% and not 5%, but still it's 4% of global turnover. That's the penalty against Facebook and the others, because they have more than 2 million users in a given country, for not taking down manifestly illicit content. 2 words on the advisory board. I think it's a wonderful idea. In the report that I wrote to UNESCO on radicalization, I had a section on policy recommendations. And this was 3 years ago. Policy recommendation number 1 was to create a content assessment procedure. Because sometimes it is hard to strike the balance. Even if you say that the content must be manifestly illicit, sometimes you really don't know whether it is an opinion or what it really is, because of course nobody wants to stop discourse and debate. So this proposal in this UNESCO document led to a proposal before the Council of Europe. And remember, that's the 47 countries which have the great privilege of having drafted, and I think it will pass, a so-called motion for recommendation, which means a treaty, which will create what we call the Internet Ombudsman. The Internet Ombudsman will be an institution which will provide such legal qualifications or recommendations for social media, and in particularly those that cannot afford having 400 lawyers and question them on a retainer basis, but small startup companies that may take down content immediately because they're afraid of facing the fine, and that would have a collateral effect on free speech, which we don't want, and that would make it easier for companies like Facebook to make sure that you don't get any disruptive new kid on the block. So we wouldn't want to do that. So for these smaller companies, we need to have an institution that could come with a recommendation. And 2 words on why is it a recommendation, not a decision. Of course, the difference is that if it's a recommendation, they're free to follow it or not. If it's a decision, it would have legal consequences, therefore it couldn't be fast, it would be subject to appeal and due process. It needs to be a recommendation. The recommendation, if it's followed, in other words, the Internet Ombudsman in a country says, this content is manifestly illicit. If Facebook were to say, we don't agree, fine. But then Facebook would expose itself to a real court case and could not plead good faith because there was this recommendation. It may plead other mitigating circumstances. If Facebook were to follow the recommendation, then of course there could be no sanctions.
Thank you.
So this is the system that we're looking at in Europe now.
Thank you.
So we're a global company, right? We're based in the United States, but we're a global company. In fact, most of our users are outside the United States and Canada now, right? So what does that mean for norms, right? What does it mean for how we, the cultural competency? How do we strike that balance, right? And it's hard. I'm an American, so like I imagine most of you all are. So we're all taught about the First Amendment, and that it's really valid here. But as I mentioned earlier, as a private company, we have no obligation to follow the First Amendment and protect our user speech. And that's why in some parts of the world, for example in France and Germany, where they've outlawed certain anti-Semitic content, we follow the law, right? And so Holocaust denial, in places where it's illegal, we take it down, right? Because we recognize that different countries and different cultures have different standards, right? And that's fine. I mean, that said, we do look to try to do whatever we can do on a global basis as much as we can, right? Terrorism, for example, we treat globally. You talked about sort of, something that's manifestly
Illicit.
Most of the stuff that would qualify as manifestly illicit, we're taking down. Now, I'm not saying we get it right all the time. We don't. We talked about, we're a big platform. But most of that's not the hard stuff. The hard stuff is the really pernicious anti-Semitic stuff. Where they're using they, where they're using parentheses, where they're using things like the happy merchant, or they're talking about vermin. They're talking about Muslims too, immigrants, right? That's the harder stuff. right? Where it's not clear, where you can't get inside someone's intent. Now, that doesn't mean we don't. We're now making a list of slurs. We're looking at, how are people, we're talking to academics about, different things, trying to get signals. Because look, you can have the best policy in the world, but unless you enforce it, it doesn't matter, right? So we're struggling with this. But that's the hard stuff. The manifestly illicit stuff, we'll take down. We'll have to either take it down because we've come across it, our computers flag it, or our users flag it, and we take it down. If it's right. I'm not saying we get it right all the time, but we do get it right most of the time, the overwhelming majority of the time. Section 230. It's a sword and a shield. Right, it does protect us from liability. So what the law says is that internet service providers are not held liable for the content that others put. But what it also allows us to do is to go out and action content. In other words, I'm not going to get sued because I take down your stuff, and because you can't say, well, this is completely fine. If we decide that your content is unacceptable based on our platform, we can take it down, and you can't sue us. And so there's two sides to that. I think this idea, the one thing I would say, and I appreciate, I've worked in the former Soviet Union, and I take that point about Ukraine and different experiences, and I have a lot of respect for our colleagues in Europe, because in many respects, I think that is where, because of the United States tradition and the First Amendment, and the fact that most of your cases probably, right as it stands right now, probably couldn't go forward, I think Europe's going to be a very interesting place to watch, because I think a lot of the future internet norms may come out of Europe. And that's possible. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, we can debate. I will say this. There is an American approach to free speech. And the way to counter bad speech is more speech, right? Now, that assumes that people are that you have to create this passion for moderation, a passion, for decency. The extremists, they're passionate, like the Nazis, right? And the reality is, we have lives, we do things, we raise our kids. So getting that same passion, now some people have it, right? And thank God you do. But that's generally the best way to counteract bad speech is more speech, right? With some very narrow exceptions. So that's the U.S. model. And then the British model is sort of, some similar. And then you've got the continental model, which you very expertly outlined. But there are other models out there. There's a Chinese model, right? And it's a model that's being, propagated. And that's not a model I would like to live under, right? And I'm not saying it's a slippery slope. I mean, I don't think we're in any danger, certainly not the United States, not even Europe. But there is another model, right? And if you have a single set of norms, right, and if it's based on population, there is a risk that our voice will be restricted, potentially. Maybe not 20 years, 30 years down the line. And so that is something to keep in mind, that there is this. So I don't think anybody on this panel is saying that the free speech is this absolute. Everybody has sort of carve-outs for it. It's a question of where you draw the line, right? And I'll just conclude that we recognize, we don't want hate groups on our platform. We don't want hate speech on our platform. We have a definition of hate speech that we think makes sense for us. But guess what? It evolves. Every 2 weeks, we have a meeting where we look at our standards and say, is it right? And if it's not, we fix it. So I'll give you an example. One group, there was a group of civil rights activists that came to us, and they were like, look, we understand what you're doing on content, but you guys have these events. I don't know if anybody used a Facebook event, like, hey, I'm having a barbecue at my house. Well, one group came to us and look, anti-Semitic groups and anti-Muslim groups are using this to organize protests in front of mosques and synagogues, right? And we did some research and we found they're right. So we adopted our policy. So now you're no longer allowed to brandish a weapon or bring weapons to a Facebook event, right? And that wasn't something that I can take credit for. Frankly, Facebook ourselves, it's not something that we came up with. We came up with because civil society groups raised that issue, right? And so that's a long way of saying our community standards aren't set in stone. They continue to evolve. So to the extent that you all think that we're not getting it right, and that there's something specific that we need to do better, we're all ears. I know I am, right? Because to me, as a person of color who's a religious minority in this country, this is not an academic thing for me. I'm not admiring this problem. This is very real to me. So it's not just professional, it's personal. And so we want to get it right. And so whether it's good ideas coming from Europe or from civil society, we're in this together, right? And so we welcome any other input or ideas that you have.
Thank you very much. We're going to take a round of questions from the audience. And we're actually going to take, oh my God. We're going to take a bunch of questions at once and let our panelists answer them in turn. As a reminder, a question is one sentence and ends with a question mark. So we have folks on either side of the room with mics. Let's start with our hostess, our introducer for the day.
My question is for Sharik, and it's more about fake news than it is hate speech or danger speech that you've been discussing, which is, why can't Facebook adjust its algorithms, its AI, so that you're not putting Mark in the position of deciding what is truth, but instead of having things shown to people based on the number of clicks, clickbait, the algorithms are adjusted so that it's taking into account the incendiary language that's in something, the source of it, is it a reliable source, and a whole series of factors to basically get some handle on the spread of fake news, which is another enormous problem we're facing through social media.
Okay, thank you. Let's get someone from, that side of the room.
Thank you. Excellent panel. Thank you very much. You mentioned about Facebook, if it's not safe, people won't use it. I would just challenge that assumption because it's a huge, everyone has their own community. So it's very safe for me and my community, but other communities can be very dangerous. So I don't think that works, but I appreciate what you're doing. Clearly, where there's no free speech, people are oppressed. And when there's free speech, people are murdered. So you have to find that balance point of how to do that. But on your question about the federal government cut of the budget and lack of prosecution, very disconcerting. And wondering if state attorney generals have stepped up their prosecution, because I know that they have in other areas where the federal government has declined.
Okay, thank you very much. This gentleman over here. Let's wait to get you a mic.
Thank you very much. Günther Spitalnick from the EU Counterterrorism Coordinator. I have one question to the colleague from Facebook. You mentioned that 99% of terrorist content that is being taken down before, or more or less before somebody else, anybody else can see it. Do you have some statistics on this? What does it mean, the 99%? About what numbers are we talking? And what's the immediate takedown? Because there is this memorandum of understanding with the European Commission and the big internet service providers, where I think it says within 24 hours, which is of course quite a long time span. How are you working on this? Thank you.
Let's take one more question from this side of the room, this young lady in the middle.
Hi, thank you all of you for everything that you do, and everything that you have said is amazing so far. But it seems to me that it could be argued that hate speech is only one symptom of the awful disease that is hate. And it seems like a lot of what you have spoken about is what you do that is very reactive and focusing more on the evil on social media. So I would love to hear about how all of your platforms and organizations can maybe, or what you do to fight the root of the hate in a more proactive way.
Okay. It sounded like the preponderance of questions were for you, Sharik. So why don't you start?
I'm shocked.
Yeah,
Probably used to that.
So on fake news, and by the way, all terrific questions and things that we struggle with every day. So our approach is to remove, reduce, and inform. So we've made the decision as a company that we don't want to be the arbiter of what's true and what's not. That comes from the very top. And so, by and large, most fake news comes from fake accounts, right? People who just set up, either spammers or for whatever reason they're trying to do clickbait. And so we have we've removed over 1 billion fake accounts, I think last quarter. And so that's the best way. One big way to tackle fake news is just get rid of the fake accounts, right? Now, the other thing is, because we don't want to be the arbiter of what's true or not, we do employ third-party fact checkers. So, for example, the Associated Press. So if there's a piece of content that is viewed as false by a fact checker, we'll reduce it in newsfeed. What that means, it's still on there. You have to go looking for it, right? But it's not going to show up. It's not going to be highlighted. And the algorithm will adjust and downrank it, right? And the third thing that we do is that we inform folks. So if there's something that's been rated as false, right? We'll say, well, hey, this article has been rated false. We should look at other content. The other thing that we've done, which is related, not directly to your point, but I do want to highlight, is that if people go looking, for example, for Heil Hitler, or some type of anti-Semitic or bigoted content, we've partnered with a group called Life After Hate, where you'll now see, take you to this website to learn from the experiences of former extremists, right? And so that kind of goes to the young lady's point about what we can do, right? So one thing I would say, because we got it wrong last election. Mark has said that we thought when we were thinking about what the security implications were, it was more of a physical hacking as opposed to fake news. And Mark said, look, we got it wrong. And we're much better off the last several election cycles. And by the way, election cycles is not just the United States, it's global, because there's always an election happening, right? Sir, your point's well taken about the fact that, that sadly, and it's not just Facebook, there's other internet providers that frankly, I would say don't have standards nearly as high as ours, where people are organizing and conversing, and there's some really bad conversations. And your point's well taken that if you're building community, unfortunately, sometimes the reality is that you're building community for people that are hate mongers. And so your point's well taken. On counterterrorism, so thank you. It's always good to see our colleagues in Europe. The reason we're able to do it in the counterterrorism context is that oftentimes the material that's posted is regurgitated over and over again. So what we're able to do is, we call it a hash, but if you think about it, it's like a fingerprint for an image, right? And so once the machine recognizes the image, you can take it down. So that's why this 99%. And there's a transparency report I can send to you just afterwards. I can tell you that sort of breaks down the statistics, right? And that's why you're able to do it very quickly. Because of hate speech, regardless of the standard, whether it's the UN standard or Facebook standard, because context is important, right? We're not able to do that. So the New Zealand video, for example, when it was highlighted to us after that tragedy, we took it down relatively quickly. The challenge was that it kept getting uploaded to YouTube and to other providers, and the file itself was changing. And because the file was changing, you couldn't fingerprint it, and so that's what made it very difficult. And so, again, part of the solution to this is just better technology. And again, back to your point, so one thing that we do is we do support a number of counter-speech efforts and digital literacy efforts. And the idea is that, you should, when you go online, there's certain basic things that you should, that we think are important, about respect and civility. Ideally, you wouldn't have to do that. But these digital literacy programs sort of highlight that, and it's particularly useful in parts of the world where the internet is still a relatively new phenomenon. And counter-speech is because we recognize that oftentimes there is no passion for civility, there is no passion for moderation, and so there are groups that we are supporting who have a voice, who are doing God's work to take on the Nazis, to take on the anti-Semites, the anti-Muslim bigots, and sort of they've got a great story to tell. They just need help telling it. So one thing that we do is help them with their counter-speech efforts. How do you use our platform? How do it's not just having great content, how do you distribute it? And that's something that's very close to my heart as well. So there are things that we're doing. We need to do a lot more.
So the questions on State's Attorney General and what more can we be doing to actually address the problem at its root?
And I want to the point about if a platform isn't safe, people won't use it. I want to agree with the gentleman over there, because I think, look, the people who were murdered in Pittsburgh, who were murdered in Charlottesville, who were murdered in Poway, California, I'm sure almost all of them were Facebook users, but none of them knew that the people were online on a platform, whether it was Facebook or otherwise, literally conspiring to murder them in their shul or in their communities. And so there aren't really business consequences for sites that allow this to happen. They continue to thrive. I think Shark is right that Facebook is at least engaging on this issue, whereas there's a lot of platforms that refuse to, and so for that, that is a good thing. But it's like whack-a-mole, and what I think all of this speaks to is the fact that social media platforms, the government, civil society, all of us were caught flat-footed by the rise of these technologies and the ways in which we just did not know how to respond, whether it is in terms of the 2016 election and the way in which these platforms were used to interfere, or the ways in which they're used to literally conspire to murder people and to perpetuate this hate and really give it a platform that it didn't have for so long. These people, Robbie Kaplan, one of the lawyers in our case, likes to say these people were in their parents' basements, they were in their dark caves, and social media has given them a place to really find each other and come out of those shadows and then act on it. Mm-hmm. And so it really is whack-a-mole, and we were caught flat-footed not knowing how to deal with that. And so, I think to the question about how are we going to be proactive as opposed to reactive, I think our case is one of the more proactive things that is actually out there. It's the only case in the country that is going after the leadership of this violent white nationalist movement right now. We are taking on the full individuals and groups that plan Charlottesville and that, as I mentioned before, really are responsible for so much other spreading of this hate and have those connections to those other awful attacks. And so in the system that we have right now, using our justice system to proactively take these guys on and bankrupt and dismantle their network is going to have ripple effects well beyond Charlottesville. And I would encourage you all
that's
to...
awesome. That's awesome. I love that.
And I would encourage you all to learn more. IntegrityFirstForAmerica.org, sign up, spread the word. Our case is going to trial, and we really want word to get out there. On the question of state AGs, very quickly, I think sort of to the point we were discussing earlier about not having the tools in our toolbox to deal with this, there aren't a lot of good statutes on the state and local level in a lot of ways. So places like New York, where I live, have stronger human rights law protections, certain laws like that when it comes to hate crimes. At the end of 2016, when we saw this spike in hate crimes, so in Brooklyn, where I live, there were swastikas being painted on a local playground. And this was just one of many incidents that happened in November 2016 for reasons many of us could imagine. And when I was working in the state attorney general's office at the time, and we put out guidance for local police departments and prosecutors to identify and prosecute hate crimes, because in many ways, particularly in smaller communities upstate and elsewhere, they didn't even have the tools to really know how to identify and take this on. And the guidance we put out became a model for a number of other state AGs to put that out there. But when it comes to these broader issues, when it comes to really the domestic terrorism, which is at the heart of a lot of the issues we're talking about, that's not something that state AGs can take on their own, or local police departments or DAs. It's going to take a national response. Social media is global. It's also going to take a global response. And until we are able to grapple with that in a real way on the national and global level, there isn't going to be a real solution. It should involve state and local prosecutors and law enforcement, but they can't do it alone, much like we can't do it alone in our case. These are all important tools, but there needs to be a comprehensive response.
Thank you. Dan, do you have anything to add?
Well, yeah, I think it's very interesting about the activities of the Attorney Generals. I learned something just a couple of days ago. I was approached by an NGO based here in DC, and they are fighting the distribution of illicit trafficking of goods on the internet, especially on Facebook. Mm-hmm. And I learned, and I was really horrified by that it goes all the way from rhino horns to human organs and drugs that are being sold on Facebook. That is pretty frightening, and I saw evidence to that effect. What is pretty comforting is that I also learned that there is an association called the National Association of Attorney Generals, or something to that effect. NAG. Okay, fine. NAG. Which came out very recently with a, you know them, that's great. Which came out very recently with a recommendation saying that social media should be held accountable for allowing the distribution of illicit goods, that the nature which I just described. Unfortunately, that will probably take them nowhere because of the Communications Decency Act that I mentioned before, which has become almost sacred, except, as we know, the on sex trafficking,
Right.
Sesta and Foster, where enormous progress has been made. So I just hope that the same progress will be made also on the trafficking of illicit goods that I just described, and also ultimately on hate speech.
Friends, please join me in thanking our panelists. And please make your way to the International Ballroom for the morning plenary. Thank you all very, very much.
Yeah, we should.